Toronto, the capital of the Canadian province of Ontario, is today Canada's largest city with a metropolitan population of some 5.9 million. It is a modern city full of skyscrapers, a center of business and finance, of science and technology and of culture, but of course, Toronto was not always as urbane as it is today. It has a wild, rough-and-tumble frontier past that in many ways underlies the development of the city and the entire country of Canada. And the shift from frontier town to modern city in Toronto really tracks back to a single event, a seminal event that changed the path of what will become one of the world's great cities. And I'm talking, of course, of that important day when a fireman and a clown walked into a brothel. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Toronto, in the middle of the 19th century, was rapidly growing. The population nearly tripled in the 30 years between 1851 and 1881, growing from around 30,000 to just short of 90,000, as ever-growing railroad networks connected to the rails across the border in the United States brought in commerce and immigrants. But Toronto was still, in many ways, a frontier town. In 1855, there were more than 150 taverns in the city of just 40,000 people. On July 12, 1855, the circus clowns of S.B. Howe's Star Troupe, Menagerie, and Circus in Toronto for a brief two-night engagement had arrived that morning and set up the circus, and then done their first performance. As the show was set up for 2 nights, they did not have to tear sets down, and so decided to spend that rare night off at the home of Mary Ann Armstrong on King Street, near the corner of King and Jarvis. This was not some ordinary house, but rather a brothel, one of many in Toronto. It happened by chance to be a brothel frequented by one of the city's volunteer fire companies. Thus, firemen and clowns were competing for the attention of the ladies of the house. And while it may seem like the start of a joke, a fireman and a clown walk into a brothel, it spelled the possibility for real trouble, because both firemen and clowns were different in 1855 than you might imagine them today. Seth B. Howes was a pioneer of the American circus. In fact, some called him the father of the American circus. House's had been the first menagerie in North America to exhibit lion cubs in the 1830s, and in 1853 had brought one of the largest circuses that had ever been seen in the Americas to New York. Early circuses tended to operate from established venue, but in North America, few cities were large enough to sustain long-term residential circuses. Rather, circuses like S.B. Howe's Star Troupe, Menagerie, and Circus were traveling affairs, where performers and traveling menageries would travel by wagon or train from town to town. That meant that all the materials, props, costumes, and even the arena itself in the form of a big top tent had to be moved, put up, and taken down by performers and circus workers. So a mid-19th century circus clown was not just, well, a clown, but a hard-working roustabout accustomed to strenuous labor and a rough lifestyle. Likewise, a Toronto fireman of 1855 was not the professional public servant that you would expect today. Toronto did not have official city fire services until 1871. While the city had a position of chief engineer who exercised a modicum of municipal control, in 1855 firefighting was done by loosely organized volunteer fire companies who elected their own officers. These companies operated as social clubs as much as fire brigades. And to get an idea of how the social clubs operated, a common term for firemen of the day was rowdies. Being a rowdy was no mean task. The work was dangerous, thankless, and strenuous. It was also performed with very little supervision by men who received very little training. While the large casks of water used to fight fires were moved by men called carters and pulled by horses, the fire wagons that pumped the water were usually hand-drawn. The men of volunteer fire brigades had to hand-push a wagon, often in a foot race with other companies, and then operate pumps powered by hand to fight the fire. Being the first to a fire was a matter of pride, so the rowdies of 1855, including the men of Toronto's Hook and Ladder Fire Company, the company of men who frequented Mary Ann Armstrong's brothel on King Street, would have been young, strong, competitive, and brave. And an incident on June 29th of 1855 was ample proof that the men of the Hook and Ladder Fire Company well deserved the title rowdy. The Hook and Ladder Fire Company was responding to a fire on Church Street. Arriving at the same time as another fire company, they decided to fight each other rather than the fire. When some of Toronto's 50 police constables tried to separate the brawling fire brigades, the firemen joined together to turn on the police, giving them a thorough beating as the building burned to the ground. The unseemly affair had been called the Firemen's Riot. And so stuffing the roustabout clowns of S.B. Howe's Star Troupe, Menagerie, and Circus into the same house of ill repute as the rowdies of the Toronto Hook and Ladder Fire Company, all of whom had had probably well too much to drink, seems in retrospect to have been, well, a recipe for disaster. How, precisely, the two gangs managed to get in a brawl the night of the 12th is still a matter of dispute. Some blame a particularly loudmouthed clown, others say that the clowns cut in line. Another story claims that a fireman named Fraser knocked the hat off a clown named Meyer, either deliberately or accidentally, and refused to pick the hat up when requested. For nearly 300 years, between the 13th and 19th centuries, a fair was regularly held in the suburb of Dublin named Donnybrook. The fair was accompanied by copious amounts of liquor and spurred so many public brawls that the term Donnybrook became a generic term for a free-for-all brawl. And a full-scale Donnybrook occurred in the home of Mary Ann Armstrong on King Street the night of July 12, 1855. The roustabout seemed to have gotten the better of the rowdies, with two members of the Toronto Hook and Ladder Company coming out badly beaten. And so the first round went to the clowns, but there would be another round, because this fight between clowns and firemen had implications for an older and more entrenched conflict in the city of Toronto. Because in Toronto, the Grand Orange Lodge of British America held sway. The Orange Order was established in 1795 as a Masonic-style Protestant fraternal order based primarily in Northern Ireland and dedicated to preserving what was called Protestant ascendancy, or the political and social domination of Ireland. The idea came to the New World with Irish immigrants, and there were Orange Order lodges in Canada at least as early as the War of 1812, with a lodge formed in Toronto in 1830. The order was particularly popular in Toronto, which would eventually earn the nickname the Belfast of Canada. In 1855, there were 20 Orange Order lodges in Toronto, and they dominated local governance. While the order had benevolent roles, especially helping Protestant immigrants to settle, it had a hold on Toronto politics that very much resembled the machine politics of New York's Tammany Hall. By creating deep social and economic ties between Protestants of all social strata, the Orange Order was able to maintain the power that, among other things, kept the new influx of Irish Catholics, fleeing the Great Famine, restricted to the lowest menial labor. By taking control of important municipal organizations, such as the volunteer militia, much of the machinery of local government, and for a time, the police and fire departments, the order was able to place great pressure on magistrates and juries, which then gave Orangemen a degree of immunity from the law. Such immunity allowed the order to utilize violence as a political tool. Between 1839 and 1866, the Orange Order was involved in 29 riots in Toronto. One of those was the Firemen's Riot of June 29th. While firemen were volunteers, participation in the volunteer fire brigades was considered an honor, one largely reserved for members of the Orange Order. After the Firemen's Riot, the firemen had been charged with assault and were brought to trial, but the constables, themselves Orangemen, deliberately confused their testimony on the stand, allowing the firemen to go free. A reformist newspaper at the time objected. It is plainly asserted by those who have access to the best information that during the days which have been allowed to elapse since the fire, a compromise has been effected between the constables and the firemen, who are too much birds of a feather long to differ. And so when the clowns roughed up the Hook and Ladder Company in Mary Ann Armstrong's brothel, they had picked a fight with men who were connected to what was called the corporation that ran the city of Toronto. And those men had a virtually free license to commit acts of violence. The next day, after the circus performed, a mob showed up, Orangemen seeking revenge, to where the circus had been camped at the Fair Green, a big grassy space on the waterfront, just a few blocks east of St. Lawrence Market. The farmers and merchants who had set up stalls nearby were told to clear out. The presence of police meant little. They were also Orangemen, and the crowd attacked the circus people, throwing stones and bottles. The circus people held them off for some time, until the Hook and Ladder Company arrived. They attacked the tents, tearing them down with their fire hooks and, somewhat ironically, setting fire to them. They tipped over circus wagons. They beat the circus workers brutally. Newspapers reported that some dived into the lake to avoid being beaten. The riot was only quelled when the mayor showed up and summoned a troop of militia. Witnesses said the mayor himself prevented a fireman from killing one of the circus clowns by prying an axe from the man's hands. Despite the violent attacks, there were no fatalities. The extent of the injuries to the circus employees is unknown, as they had no incentive to report to the police. The circus pulled up stakes and left town as fast as they could. But the people of Toronto were unimpressed when, of the 17 men that were accused of having participated in the riot, only one was convicted. As with the firemen's riot, the constables of the town conveniently could not recall any of the other men of having been there, and once again the Orangemen had escaped consequence for their violence. Eventually an inquiry was demanded, and that led to a process that eventually reformed both departments. Both of the departments had people being appointed in such a way that they were really more accountable to politicians than to the people or the law. And so the province finally made the necessary amendments in 1858, and a provincial board was created to look at better methods of community policing, and the entire Toronto Police Department was fired and started again from scratch. The modernization of these public services helped to shepherd Toronto from a wild frontier town into a modern city. Toronto saw enormous growth during the latter half of the 19th century, and by the turn of the century boasted more than 200,000 residents, and became a city so well known for its strict moral code that it was called Toronto the Good. And that all started because a fireman and a clown walked into a brothel. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.